Okay, this is video lecture number 70. Today we are talking about the United States in World War I. Our subsections today are the beginning of the war from 1914, and then we're going to take that through 1917. From neutrality to war, over there, war on the home front, and women's voting rights. So, there's a lot to cover for World War I. We could spend a lot of time on World War I. So this video lecture is going to be long, even though we're just talking about some very basic issues. So we're not going to do a big introduction. We're going to just jump right in and get right to the subsections because, again, we have a lot to cover. So some of this is going to be review from your sophomore year. So hopefully you will recognize a lot of the issues that I'm getting ready to discuss. So let's jump in with the beginning. The first subsection, the Great War begins, 1914 through 1917. So while competing imperial claims fostered conflicts around the globe, a war of unprecedented scale was brewing in Europe. Germany, a rising power, had humiliated France in the Franco-Prussian War in 1870. Its subsequent military buildups terrified its neighbors. To the east, the Ottoman Empire was disintegrating and losing its grip on the Balkans, while European powers jockeyed to claim and defend their colonies in Africa, in the Middle East, and in Asia. Out of these conflicts, two rival power blocs emerged: the Triple Alliance, which was Germany, Austria, Hungary, and Italy, and the Triple Entente, which was Britain, France, and Russia. Within each alliance, national governments pursued their own interests, but were bound to one another by public and secret treaties. The spark that ignited World War I came in the Balkans, where Austria, Hungary, and Russia competed for control. Austria's 1908 seizure of the Ottoman provinces of Bosnia and Herzegovina, with their substantial Slavic populations, angered Russia and its ally, the independent Slavic state of Serbia. In response, Serbian revolutionaries recruited Bosnian Slavs, including university student Gavrilo Princip, to resist Austrian rule. In June 1914, in the town of Sarajevo, Princip assassinated Archduke Franz Ferdinand, heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne. Like dominoes falling, the system of European alliances rapidly pushed all the powers into war. Austria-Hungary blamed Serbia for the assassination, and they declared war on July 28th. Russia, tied by secret treaty to Serbia, mobilized its armies against Austria-Hungary. Russia's move prompted Germany to declare war on Russia and its ally France. As a preparation for attacking France, and a way to get to France, Germany launched a brutal invasion of the neutral country of Belgium, which caused Great Britain to declare war on Germany. By August 4th, most of Europe was at war, and the two sides were now the Allies, which was Britain, France, and Russia. They confronted what was now called the Central Powers of Germany and Austria-Hungary, joined in November by the Ottoman Empire. Two major war zones emerged. Germany battled the British and the French, and later on the Americans, on the Western Front. Assisted by the Austrians and Hungarians, Germany also fought Russia on the Eastern Front. Now, because most of the warring nations held colonial empires, the conflict spread to the Middle East, to Africa, and to China, throwing the future of those areas completely into question. Hoping to secure valuable colonies, Italy, and soon Japan, joined the Allied side, while Bulgaria linked up with the Central Powers. For 4 bloody years, millions of soldiers fought a war of attrition in heavily fortified trenches that cut across a narrow swath of Belgium and northeastern France. Soldiers hunkered in wet trenches for months on end. One side and then the other would mount attacks across no man's land, only to be mangled by barbed wire or mowed down by machine guns. Struggling to break the stalemate, Germany launched an attack at a place called Ypres in April 1915 that introduced a new nightmare: poison gas. As the Germans tried to break through French lines at Verdun, Between February and December of 1916, they suffered 450,000 casualties. The French fared even worse, with 550,000 dead or wounded soldiers. It was all to no avail. From 1914 to 1918, the Western Front barely moved. Okay, on to the next section, from neutrality to war. At the outbreak of the war, President Wilson called on Americans to be neutral in fact as well as in name, impartial in thought as well as in action. If he kept the U.S. out of the conflict, Wilson reasoned, he could influence the post-war settlement, much as President Theodore Roosevelt had helped arbitrate the Russo-Japanese War in 1905. Even if Wilson had wanted to unite Americans behind the Allies, that would have been nearly impossible in 1914. Many Irish Americans viewed Britain as an enemy, resenting its continued occupation of Ireland. And also, millions of German Americans, especially in the Midwest, maintained ties to their homeland. Progressive-minded Republicans, such as Senator Robert La Follette of Wisconsin, vehemently opposed taking sides in what was largely considered to be just a European fight, as did socialists who condemned the war as a conflict among greedy capitalist and imperialist nations. Two giants of American industry, Andrew Carnegie and Henry Ford, opposed the war. In December of 1915, Ford sent 100 men and women to Europe on a peace ship to urge an end to the conflict. The United States wished to trade with all of the warring nations, but this proved impossible. In September 1914, the British imposed a naval blockade on the Central Powers to cut off vital supplies of food and military equipment. The Wilson administration protested this infringement of the rights of neutral carriers, but did not take any action. An imbalance in trade favoring Britain over Germany undercut U.S. neutrality, tying America's economic health to Allied victory. If Germany won and Britain and France defaulted on their debts, American companies would suffer catastrophic losses. To challenge the British Navy, then, Germany launched a devastating new weapon called the U-boat, or the submarine. In April of 1915, the German embassy in Washington issued a warning that all ships flying the flags of Britain or its allies were liable to destruction. A few weeks later, a U-boat off the coast of Ireland torpedoed the British luxury liner Lusitania, killing 1,198 people, including 128 Americans. The attack on the passenger ship incensed Americans. President Wilson sent strongly worded protests to Germany, but tensions subsided by September when Germany announced that the U-boats would no longer attack passenger vessels without issuing first a warning. Nonetheless, the Lusitania crisis prompted Wilson to reconsider his options. He quietly tried to mediate an end to the European conflict. Finding neither side seriously interested in peace, Wilson endorsed a $1 billion buildup of the U.S. Army and Navy in the fall of 1915. Despite Wilson's campaign slogan, events pushed him towards war. On February 1st, 1917, Germany resumed unrestricted submarine warfare, a decision dictated by the impasse on the Western Front. In response, Wilson broke off diplomatic relations with Germany. A few weeks later, newspapers published an intercepted dispatch from the German Foreign Secretary, a man named Arthur Zimmermann, to his minister in Mexico City. The note urged Mexico to join the Central Powers. Zimmermann promised that if the United States entered the war, Germany would help Mexico to recover their lost territories of Texas, New Mexico, and Arizona. With Pancho Villa's border raids still fresh in the public mind, the Mexico-Germany threat jolted American opinion. Meanwhile, German U-boats attacked American ships without warning, sinking 3 on March 18th alone. On April 2nd, 1917, Wilson asked Congress for a declaration of war. Reflecting his Protestant zeal and his progressive idealism, Wilson promised that American involvement would make the world, quote, safe for democracy. On April 6th, the United States declared war on Germany. Reflecting the nation's divided views, the vote was far from unanimous. 6 senators and 50 members of the House voted against entry, including Representative Jeanette Rankin of Montana, the first woman elected to Congress. So let's go to the next section then, over there. In 1917, the U.S. Army numbered fewer than 200,000 soldiers. To field a fighting force, Congress instituted a military draft in May 1917. President Wilson chose General Pershing to head the American Expeditionary Force, referred to as the AEF. When the United States entered the war, German U-boats were sinking 900,000 tons of Allied ships each month. By sending merchant and troop ships in armed convoys, the U.S. Navy cut that monthly rate to 400,000 tons by the end of 1917. With trench warfare grinding on, Allied commanders pleaded for American soldiers to fill their depleted units, but Pershing waited until the AEF reached full strength. Peace with Russia freed Germany to launch a major offensive on the Western Front. By May of 1918, German troops advanced to within 50 miles of Paris. As Allied leaders called desperately for U.S. troops, Pershing finally committed about 60,000 men to help the French in the battles of Château-Thierry and Belleau Wood. With American soldiers arriving in massive numbers, Allied forces brought the German offensive to a halt in July. By September, they eventually forced a German retreat. Then Pershing pitted over 1 million American soldiers against an outnumbered and exhausted German army in the Argonne Forest. By early November, this attack had broken the German defense of a crucial rail hub at Sedan. The cost was high: 26,000 Americans killed and 95,000 wounded. The flood of American troops and supplies across the Atlantic turned the tide. Recognizing the inevitability of defeat and facing popular uprisings at home, the German government signed an armistice on November 11, 1918. The Great War was over. Now, by the end of World War I, almost 4 million American men, popularly known as doughboys, wore U.S. uniforms, as did several thousand female nurses. The recruits reflected America's heterogeneity. 1/5 had been born outside the United States, and soldiers spoke 49 different languages. Over 400,000 African American men enlisted, accounting for 13% of the armed forces. Their wartime experiences were often grim. They served in segregated units and were given the most menial tasks. Racial discrimination disrupted military efficiency and erupted in violence at several camps. About 2/3 of American soldiers in France saw military action, but most escaped the horrors of sustained trench warfare. During the brief period of American participation in the war, 53,000 servicemen died in action. Another 63,000 died from disease, mainly the devastating influenza pandemic that began early in 1918, and over the next 2 years killed 50 million people throughout the world. The nation's military deaths, though substantial, were a mere speck compared to the 500,000 American civilians who died of the flu. Not to mention the 8 million soldiers lost by the Allies and the Central Powers. War on the home front is our next section then. American businesses made big bucks from World War I as grain, weapons, and manufactured goods flowed to Britain and France. The United States became a creditor nation. Moreover, as the war drained British financial reserves, U.S. banks provided capital for investments around the globe. At the same time, government powers expanded. with new federal agencies overseeing almost every single part of the economy. The War Industries Board, the WIB, established in July 1917, directed military production. The WIB allocated scarce resources among industries, ordered factories to convert to war production, set prices, and standardized procedures. During the war, suppressing dissent became a near obsession for President Wilson. In April of 1917, Wilson formed the Committee on Public Information, the CPI, a government propaganda agency headed by journalist George Creel. The committee set out to mold Americans into one white-hot mass, quote, of war patriotism. The CPI touched the lives of practically every civilian. It distributed 75 million pieces of literature and enlisted thousands of volunteers to deliver short, pro-war speeches at movie theaters. During the war, Congress passed two new laws to curb dissent. The Espionage Act of 1917 imposed stiff penalties for anti-war activities. The Sedition Act of 1918 prohibited any words or behavior that might, quote, incite, provoke, or encourage resistance to the United States or promote the cause of its enemies. Because these acts defined treason and sedition loosely, they led to the conviction of more than 1,000 people. In Schenck versus United States, 1919, the Supreme Court upheld the conviction of a socialist who was jailed for circulating pamphlets that urged Army draftees to resist induction. The justices followed this with a similar decision in Abrams versus United States, 1919, stating that authorities could prosecute speech that they believed to pose a clear and present danger to the safety of the country. World War I also created new economic opportunities at home. Jobs in war industries drew thousands of people to the cities, including more immigrants. For the first time, with so many men in uniform, jobs in heavy industry opened to African Americans. Well before the war, some Southern blacks had moved to the North. Wartime jobs accelerated the pace. During World War I, more than 400,000 African Americans moved to such cities as St. Louis, Chicago, New York, and Detroit in what became known as the Great Migration. Wartime labor shortages also prompted Mexican Americans in California, Texas, New Mexico, and Arizona to leave farm labor for industrial jobs in rapidly growing southwestern cities. Thousands of Mexicans also entered the United States as a result of displacement from the Mexican Revolution of 1910 to 1917. Now, women were the largest group to take advantage of wartime employment opportunities. About 1 million women joined the paid labor force for the first time, while another 8 million gave up low-wage service jobs for higher-paying industrial work. So let's continue on with that theme with women's rights and looking at their voting rights for our last section. One of the war's most positive legacies was women's suffrage. When the United States entered the war, the National American Women's Suffrage Association, through the support of its 2 million members behind Wilson, the association women in thousands of communities promoted food conservation, they aided war workers, and they distributed emergency relief through organizations such as the Red Cross. Alice Paul and the National Woman's Party took a more confrontational strategy. As a lobbyist for the National American Women's Suffrage Association, Paul found her cause dismissed by congressmen. And in 1916, she founded the NWP. Inspired by militant British suffragists, the party began picketing the White House in July 1917. Paul and other NWP activists faced arrest for obstructing traffic, and they were sentenced to 7 months in jail. They protested by going on a hunger strike, which prison authorities met with forced feeding. Public shock at the women's treatment put pressure on Wilson and drew attention to the suffrage cause. Impressed by the Suffrage Association's patriotism and also worried by the NWP's militancy, the anti-suffrage Wilson reversed his position. In January 1918, he urged support for women's suffrage as a war measure. The constitutional amendment quickly passed the House of Representatives. It took 18 months to get through the Senate and another year to win ratification by the states. On August 26, 1920, Tennessee gave the 19th Amendment the last vote it needed. Okay, so that covers it. World War I. At this time, go ahead and answer your review questions. Take careful notes because there's a lot of information in this one. Again, continue on with your reading and your work.